I'm Bill Kavanaugh. I'm director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul University. We're a center focused on the Church in the Global South and also the Church of the Global South in the U.S. And so this lecture tonight is part of our series on immigrant Catholicism in the United States. And we have a couple more events coming up after this as well. This is our first in-person event we've had in over 2 years, and it's going to take people some time to get used to that, but it's also our first hybrid event, so we're delighted that people are joining us from around the world on their computers as well. And tonight we're really delighted to invite back home Deborah Kanter, who is a native of the Chicago area and is professor emeritus at the Albion College in Michigan, where she taught U.S., Latino, Latin American, and immigration history. And she still remains engaged in mentorship of first-generation college students. She's going to talk tonight about her book, Chicago Católico, Making Catholic Parishes Mexican, which was awarded the Hamlin Garland Prize in Popular History by the Midwestern History Association and the Best of Illinois History Award by the Illinois State Historical Society. And she's busy on another book as well on Catholic ministry to farm workers in the Bracero era. She has other books on Mexico. She lived in Mexico for 4 years, and her first book, Hijos del Pueblo, Gender, Family, and Community in Rural Mexico, is based on those experiences. So there's nobody better to talk about Mexican Catholics in Chicago than Deborah Kanter. So please join me in welcoming Deborah.
Okay. Everybody can hear me, right? Okay. So, this is my first in-person event in Chicago in 26 months. So my book, Chicago Católico, actually, I launched it at the National Museum of Mexican Art on February 7th, 2020. And, you know, there were like 100 people there, and we had abrazos and handshakes, and it was like a week later you were beginning to wonder whether maybe that was a good idea. But the COVID was only in like New York and California, right? So anyways, so I did get to have that big public launch. At first, when the pandemic canceled all my events, I felt a little sorry for myself. But then I went into the world of virtual events, and it was so cool to do events and have people log on from Mexico City and people from Los Angeles and Texas and New York. And so, you know, I made a lot of lemonade out of the lemon. I want to thank a couple people. So DePaul has been very welcoming, and Karen Kraft did a great job in answering a lot of questions and thinking about things. Marlon Aguilar also has been very helpful. I also want to thank Amanda Thompson, who invited me to meet students tonight, and Bill Kavanaugh, and thank the Center for World Catholicism. I'm very happy to be part of this event on immigrant Catholicism in the United States with some really great speakers. Like you had Don Pasiga, and you have Matthew Kressler coming in May, I think it is. So people should come out for that. So what I'm planning to do is to talk for about 35 minutes, and I will leave time for questions. And let's see, how do we do this? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I started with this project on Chicago. Once upon a time, when I was a graduate student in history, I was a historian of colonial Mexico. And I worked with a lot of handwritten Spanish language documents like the one you're seeing here that turned into my dissertation and my first book, which is kind of an ethno-history of gender, looking at indigenous Mexicans. During the 1990s and 2000s, I would come back to Chicago, where I'm from, and I would visit neighborhoods that were transitioning and becoming more Mexican. And one day in the summer of 2000, I was in the Little Village neighborhood, 26th Street, and I walked into a church called St. Agnes of Bohemia, and the Spanish language mass had just ended. And I walked into this church, and the kids were kind of running around, and people were standing around chit-chatting, and I just thought, oh my God, this is like being in Mexico. And the Virgin of Guadalupe was up front, this and that. I started walking around the church, and I'm looking carefully at the imagery, and I look up at the windows, and it turns out every window in Santa Ynez, in St. Agnes Church, every window had the names of the donors in Czech. So, you've got that one right here. And this raised a question for me. Like, it might feel like the most Mexican church in Chicago, but it clearly was not always Mexican. This used to be a Czech church. And I wondered, what was it like to be the first woman or man from Mexico to walk into an entirely Czech, maybe Polish and Czech parish? And I wondered what it felt like. And I decided I would go to the archive for 1 week to see if there was anything to learn about the subject matter. And so I went to the Archdiocesan Archives for the week, and then I kind of spent like 18 years working on this project. I wrote the other book in the middle. So I started off with manuscript primary sources, but quite soon I started getting to know people who had grown up in these parishes, or people who had immigrated and joined these parishes as young adults. And I started doing what we might call participant observer activities, which I think I just thought it was hanging out with my new friends. So these lovely women with the yellow wall behind them, these are Mexican-American women who grew up on the near west side of Chicago, and they played sports together at St. Francis Church. These are the Cobras. They were like an award-winning, prize-winning volleyball team, and they played softball, and they would get together into their 80s for Cobras reunions, and then I got to come. I went to like 3 of them. On the other side of the slide, I can't tell if it's left or right, I went to an all-year school reunion from Providence of God. The older people at Providence of God, the older alums, were all Lithuanian American, and the younger alums were all Mexican American. And there are the teaching sisters, the Sisters of St. Casimir from the southwest side of Chicago. And I would volunteer at events, and I still volunteer at events. This is at St. Procopius, a one-time Czech parish on 18th Street. And I've gone now for 3 years and helped the Guadalupanas, the ladies devoted to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I've helped them run the enchilada stand. So they gave me an apron. In the process of spending time with people from these parishes, I learned that a parish isn't just a church, which is what I thought it was going into this project. I thought it was like the sanctuary and mass. Instead, I learned that a parish is so much more to people. It's, a form of community, it's family, and it was so much more than Sunday morning for people. I'm going to read briefly, mostly I'll be talking today, but I want to give you a brief overview of my book. So my book tells the story of how Mexicans have made a home in Chicago and its churches. Today, Mexicans and other Latinos are transforming the Archdiocese into Chicago Católico in ways that past generations of German and Irish bishops, priests, and sisters never could have imagined. I use the Catholic parish to view Mexican immigration and transformation in the U.S. For individuals arriving from Mexico, these parishes served as a refugio. Mexicans fiercely attached themselves to specific parishes, much like European ethnic groups in days gone by. The parish for them was a place to speak Spanish. It was a place to learn about job leads or maybe about a new apartment up for rent. And it was definitely a place to reminisce about Mexico. At the same time, these parishes had an Americanizing influence on Mexican members. Men and women took part in regular devotions and parish activities in ways very similar to Polish, Italian, or Irish Catholics elsewhere in the city. Their children participated in May crownings of the Virgin Mary, and they played baseball on parish sports teams. Many Mexican-American lay people gained a sense of Mexicanidad by participating in its religious and social events. The parish, I argue, the parish acted as a glue that connected immigrant parents and their U.S.-reared children. So, when does this all start? We're going to step back 100 years ago, and we're going to think about some of the first Mexicans to arrive in Chicago. And one of the ways we're going to do this is we're going to look at a retablo. And I guess it's not everything here, but the retablo is a long one. So these are devotional paintings and Catholic where a person makes a promise to the Virgin Mary, a different saint, asking for help. And when the help is granted, then they paint this to show that, they received the help, that the promise was kept. This retablo that we're looking at actually is about an event that happened in Chicago. So you can see the buildings, you can see the traffic, the pollution, right? This is Chicago in the fall of 1918. And in the middle of the retablo, you can see Matias Lara, who is kneeling in front of the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos. The Virgin of San Juan is the second most popular Virgin Mary in Mexico after the Virgin of Guadalupe. So what was Matias's problem in 1918? So I'm going to read a little translation from the text which he wrote at the bottom of his painting. Finding myself lost in Chicago, I entrusted myself to the Virgin of San Juan, asking that she illuminate the road that I sought. I gave her thanks for having granted me what I asked. I dedicate the present offering as a commemoration. Basically, Matias Lara ends up in Chicago. He's looking for a street. He doesn't speak any English. He's completely overwhelmed by the hubbub of the train stations or the loop or whatever. And he doesn't know what to do. So he asked the Virgin Mary to help him. And I guess he got to where he needed to go. Notably, at the time that Matias came in 1918, there were no churches that regularly offered ministry to Spanish-speaking people. But he brought his faith with him. So it was there. There just wasn't any place to sort of demonstrate that in Chicago. Another pair of early arrivals in Chicago, Elidia Barroso came to Chicago around 1924, and I was fortunate enough to have her diary, which she kept, which I actually transcribed and translated, and it was published in Diálogos, which is a publication at DePaul. So, and that's available online, and it's very unusual to have a Mexican immigrant woman's diary. So, Elidia moves to the Chicago area. Her niece Loretta was born here. She was the first member of the Barroso family to be born in the United States. In time, Elidia and her sister, Loretta's mother, they landed at St. Francis Church, which was one of the first two churches to offer ministry in Spanish. And so Loretta had her first, the little Loretta with her ice cream. She had her first communion at St. Francis Church. She baptized her 4 children there. She was married there. She got married before she baptized her children. And 5 generations of the Barroso family have gone through rites of passage at this Mexican church. And 4 years ago, I attended little Loretta's memorial mass. She passed when she was 93. The process of building a Mexican identity and community well beyond the southwestern United States began at 2 Chicago parishes in the 1920s. The Spanish-speaking Claretian missionaries ministered to Chicago's growing population. This missionary order arrived in the United States in 1902. First, they were based in Texas. When the Claretians heard that 3,000 Mexicans lived in Chicago in the 1920s, they considered how to reach the Mexicanos up north. And actually, one of the people who brokered the coming of the Claretians to Chicago was actually Mother Cabrini. Mother Cabrini was, patron saint of immigrants. She was aware of the need for ministry to Spanish-speaking people. She spoke to Cardinal Mundelein, and the Claretians reached out, and within a decade, they had established 2 parishes in Chicago. The very oldest one is in the South Chicago neighborhood near the Indiana border, and the one that I'm going to concentrate on is St. Francis of Assisi. This was an old German parish. It had been built in like the 1870s. The original, like the stained glass windows, had the names of the donors in German, right? And it had all the German lay societies. But in 1926, they began to hold Mass for Spanish-speaking people. And not long after, St. Francis sort of earned the name amongst Latinos as La Catedral Mexicana. Some people will call it La Catedral Hispana or Latina, but Catedral Mexicana is a much more common phrase because it's very strongly associated historically with Mexicans. From the 1920s through the 1960s, St. Francis, its church, rectory, school, convent, and its gym provided a lively, nurturing home for Mexican immigrants and Mexican-American young people. Here we see the children all lined up in front of the Claretians' great devotion, the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The reality is Mexican people were much more interested in the Virgin of Guadalupe, but if the Claretians said, we're taking a picture, the photographer's here, so they got all these kids to line up. And actually, one thing you might notice here, one of my favorite things, like from the 1940s. This was a space where Mexican people were welcome to worship in ways that were familiar to them. So this is either way, we're not going to bring a retablo to a Polish or an Irish church, but at St. Francis or Our Lady of Guadalupe in South Chicago, this was fine. And then what we've got, that big street scene on the other side of the slide, that was the dedication of the St. Francis Youth Center. It was a CYO gym, which was built. This was one of the oldest neighborhoods in Chicago, the Near West Side. This is a few blocks from Hull House. It's where UIC is today. The neighborhood was really kind of crumbling, and a lot of people didn't have like hot water in their apartments. They shared bathrooms in their apartment buildings. This was like kind of the Lower East Side of Chicago, right? And 1948, the Mexican church builds a freestanding gym designed by an architect. This is like, we're staying, and these people deserve the best. And there was a huge parade, and the cardinal came for the dedication. So while the early families at St. Francis, they tended to be working poor people, their children may have grown up in poverty, but with a parish to call their own, they did not feel marginalized. The Mexican church anchored the community, and its children grew up with a positive grounding in Mexican and U.S. Catholic traditions. Their affirmative experience at St. Francis would manifest itself as thousands of Mexican origin people entered new neighborhoods in the 1960s. In new neighborhoods and in new parishes dominated by Euro-Americans, many former St. Francis members would assume a vanguard position. And one of the reasons why Mexicans begin to really disperse in a lot of places in the city is that this is where the University of Illinois decides to build its Chicago campus. So one of the only things that is left standing in that neighborhood is St. Francis Church, and the gym is still there, and then that little tiny piece of Hull House. But Hull House had once been an entire city block, right? So that little farmhouse you see there is like a drop in the bucket. But it was clear that the neighborhood was, the gig was up, and by 1961 they're bringing in bulldozers and really forcing people out. And basically the entire Mexican residential population of the Near West Side, it's like 40,000 people, they have to go. Their church is still there. They have to leave their school, and the school shut down by 1964. One of the neighborhoods that they moved into was Pilsen. And if you know Chicago, you know that it's just on the other side of a bunch of train lines. You drive under a viaduct and you get to Pilsen. These are neighborhoods that are adjacent, but they were pretty separate, I think, in the past. Things to notice about this map of Pilsen, which I had made for my book. Pilsen is about 1.5 miles long. It's centered on 18th Street, and it had 13 Catholic churches. These churches were built between 1875 and 1915. 13 Catholic churches within 1.5 miles. And one of my favorite games to play with myself when I go to Pilsen, like, when I'm standing on an L platform or end up on the roof of something, it's like, how many church steeples can I see? And if you're lucky, you can count like 4, right? And some of these churches are very close to each other. But why 13 churches? So that's because they were almost all founded by different ethnic groups. So on the eastern edge of Pilsen, right in the shadow of what is the Illinois Expressway, Providence of God, which was built by Lithuanians. Am I okay by being off mic? Should I go back to mic? It's okay. I'm good. So.
For the people online, it might be better.
Okay. I'm good. So we've gone to the east of the neighborhood and moving west. St. Procopius, established by Czech immigrants and their families. Moving further west, St. Adelbert's, which is kind of a big Roman basilica built by the Poles, which backs onto the railroad tracks. St. Anne's further west, another Polish parish. To the south, St. Paul's, which was a German parish. So there was one territorial parish, St. Pius, English speaking, right? But mostly the parishioners in Pilsen were people of different Slavic groups. This gives you a little snapshot of the kinds of folks that occupied, that were members of the different churches in Pilsen. We've got the Czech, female societies at St. Procopius in 1950, and we have some of the stalwarts of Holy Trinity Croatian Catholic Church on the other side. So this was the kind of situation where you had Mexicans walking into these churches that literally belonged to other ethnic groups, and where you were really not going to, the Mass would be celebrated in Latin, and everything else would be like Croatian or Polish. And so this is what I set out to learn about in my research, is what was the experience of coming into very different and very historic turf that belonged to different groups. I was trying to find out, when does the first Mexican arrive at these parishes? And I had the chance to go through parish bulletins from St. Pius. This would be the territorial or English-speaking parish. And so this is a parish bulletin from 1947. And almost everybody in this parish has a Slavic last name, mostly Polish. But the Friday 7 o'clock Mass was dedicated to thank San Juan de los Lagos, the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos, the same Virgin Mary that Matias Lara had been devoted to 30 years earlier. So this, as far as I'm concerned, is the first Mexican parishioner at St. Pius. This person's willing to go into the office and to sort of make this claim for the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos. This is somebody who probably, this is his or her church. People in the 1950s, Mexican people, moved in from the near West Side, and they also were coming directly from Mexico and from Texas. And it was pretty easy to move into Pilsen. Landlords were willing to rent them apartments, and people who were moving out of the neighborhood were very willing to sell their homes. For those of you who know Chicago history, this was not the experience that African Americans had when they wanted to move into the same neighborhoods where they couldn't rent apartments and people would firebomb the homes that they bought. That's not what happened in Pilsen. It was pretty easy to move in. So why was it easy to move in? We have a little sample of this from the beginning of Catholic immigration into Pilsen. This is from a Catholic Charities report. And their comments on Pilsen is that Mexicans are still viewed as invaders by the older residents, many of whom still retain their own ethnic outlook and language. However, the Mexican is considered a much lesser evil than the surrounding Negroes. So one takeaway that we could get from this of why Mexicans were relatively included into Pilsen is they were included because they weren't black, right? The black population in Chicago, well, for most of the 20th century, 1940s and 1950s, it's growing exponentially, and that's really the thing on the mind of most white Chicagoans. They're very concerned about if their neighborhoods will change. If their neighborhoods change, will they be able to keep their parishes open? Mexicans are not black, and also they were Catholic. And in many cases in Pilsen, it's clear that the parish priests understood we're going to open the door, they're going to put $1 in the collection basket, and even if the checks start to go or the Croatians start to go, we'll still have parishioners, right? So we get kind of a grudging acceptance by many priests in the 1950s. Some of the pioneers of Mexican integration into the parishes are actually the school children. And this is from Providence of God School, which was the Lithuanian parish in the neighborhood. And for those of you who are new to Chicago, Chicago has the largest Lithuanian immigration population in the United States. I think I'm correct about that. And whenever I meet somebody who's Lithuanian American, I'm like, are you from Chicago? They always are. So there's something out there in Pennsylvania, I don't know. Cleveland maybe also. But Chicago, big on Lithuanians. This is Sister Helene's class. Sister Helene is in the back corner, and her 1957 grade 4 class is pretty full. And most of these kids are Lithuanian American. A few of them might actually be children who were born in deported persons camps in Europe. They might be immigrant Lithuanians. You'll notice the board by the windows is a board for the Lithuanian national anthem, Lithuania, Our Dear Homeland. This is the song that the children would have sung commonly at Providence of God. And then look at the boy who's sitting in the front row with the great smile. And is he wearing a tie? I think he's wearing a tie. I love it. He really dressed up our picture day. Well, they all really dressed up our picture day. That's a Mexican-American boy. And if you look carefully, there's a few more faces. This classroom looks to me like it's got maybe 3 Mexican-American children. And these were kids who were going to learn to say the catechism in Lithuanian. So, and the same thing was going on at the Catholic schools throughout the Pilsen neighborhood. Parents didn't necessarily want to go to church at these parishes, but they were definitely willing to enroll their children. And the sisters and the priests were very happy to take them. So it's St. Adalbert's, historically a very Polish parish. In 1960, notice on the back bulletin board, Americans all, very common phrase in the 50s. Americans all, and they're all pretty jammed in there because that's what Catholic classrooms were like at that time. Almost all of these kids are Polish and Polish American, but there's a few of them. Like in the second row, the girl with the dark hair and the glasses, that's a Mexican American girl. There's no question. So by 1974, the numbers have really changed. And better yet, we've got the names of the kids. So we've got Anthony Cardenas, we have James Chavez, we have Porfirio Gomez, right? And these classrooms are actually mixed, right? There are Polish kids there as well as the Mexicans. But it's the kids who are sort of first dealing, they're kind of the first wave coming into these historically Slavic parishes. And another way that the neighborhood was changing was businesses were coming in that catered to Mexican people, that were run by Mexican and Mexican-American families. Those of you who know Chicago well probably recognize the El Nopal Bakery sign. And for people who don't know Mexico, a nopal is a prickly pear cactus. Kind of doesn't really get that much more Mexican than a nopal as a symbol of something that is bien Mexicano. The Bonilla family had started the El Nopal Bakery in what we call Greektown today, right? To the north of UIC. But as that neighborhood was changing, as the Mexicans were all basically being forced out, they were losing their Mexican clientele at their El Nopal Bakery up on Halsted. So they followed their clientele and they purchased what had been the Ace Bakery from the Fritz family. And in 1961, they set up shop on Blue Island in the middle of Pilsen. And they had their, so we've got Francisco and Celia Bonilla. And Francisco's holding his son, Frank, who is now a friend of mine, who very kindly let me use this photo for my book. And I hadn't met him. It was like, we had some long phone conversations. So he really wants his parents' memories to be kept in certain ways. Anyways, what I loved about this photograph was that the day they took over the property from the preceding family, who did they bring along to the transfer? Father Raymond Bianchi, who was the Claretian priest at St. Francis of Assisi. So to bless the new building. He had been their priest at St. Francis. He knew them. They gave charity to the Mexican sisters. They gave them, day-old bread and this and that. So this was another way, not just in the churches, that the neighborhood was changing and becoming Mexicano and also Católico. By 1965, 3 churches in Pilsen were celebrating Misa en Español. And for those of you who are familiar with Catholic studies and Catholic history, this is really kind of opened up by Vatican II, right? Because until Vatican II in the early 60s, the Mass everywhere is celebrated in Latin, right? So, but now, not only could the homily and the hymns and the announcements be in Spanish, but the actual Misa could be in Spanish. So 3 out of 13 churches were celebrating Misa en Español in 1965. Let's think about what's going on here in the late 1960s. We're going to the west of Pilsen to St. Anne's, historically a very Polish parish. The installation of the Virgin of Guadalupe at St. Anne's took place around 1969, and it marked a real turning point. A Mexican family at the parish donated the image. As they recall, it came from Mexico with papers and all. Lupe and Matias Almendares were selected to carry the image, and they joined the couple that donated it through the nearby streets. The 2 couples proudly carried the Virgin of Guadalupe on a 2-block procession led by a priest before entering St. Anne's Sanctuary. For decades, The image remained prominently displayed by the main altar, parallel to Our Lady of Czestochowa. Taking part in the procession and the installation, Matthias remembered, taking part felt beautiful. Soon after, Mexican parishioners purchased a Mexican flag to place by the Virgin's side. The installation of the Mexican Virgin marked a change to Mexicans and Poles alike. And the Almendare's daughter remembers it this way. With the installation of the Guadalupana, the Polish people realized you weren't going anywhere. And there was just sort of like, there began to be much more collaboration and less grudges. But I wouldn't say there was a clean break with that. I want to tell you the story about the adult woman in this photograph from 1976. So the adult woman standing in the back, her name was Julia Rodriguez. And I went to visit Julia Rodriguez. She was about 80 in her apartment in Pilsen. She was in what they call an English basement apartment in Pilsen, which means it's kind of a basement, but it has windows. And, we did the agreement for the oral history and blah, blah, blah. I get her to sign the thing. And she sort of pauses before I turn on the tape recorder for her interview. And she said, ¿Se puede hacer la entrevista en español? I was like, yeah, we can do the interview in Spanish. This is the thing. Julia was from Texas. She was from the Rio Grande Valley. One of the first times that I really got to know somebody from that part of Texas. And as we start the interview, I'm listening to her, but I'm also thinking, how did this woman grow up in the United States? And she's like 80, and she's been in Chicago for 50, 60 years, and she prefers to do this in Spanish. And then I realized, that was actually my grandmother's story, who came from Eastern Europe. It's sort of the same situation. So, if you live in an enclave, then maybe you stick with your language. So as I interviewed Julia, she told me about her childhood in Texas. Her family were migrant workers. They traveled to pick cotton. They traveled throughout Texas. They went to Mississippi. Because they were migrant workers, she didn't have much schooling. She never really got to do a full year of schooling anywhere. She moved from place to place. There were definitely times where she was out in the fields filling up the cotton bags along with her parents. She gets married to Ruben, who she's standing next to, and moved to Chicago in the late 1950s. And the nearby church was St. Procopius, the old Czech parish. And I asked her, I said, what was it like to go to St. Procopius? And she says, los polacos como que no. The Poles, no way. And this phrase, los polacos, this is a very common Mexican Chicago phrase to talk about anybody from Eastern Europe. They'll use the phrase polacos to talk about Czechs, Croatians, Slovaks. So polacos just kind of works for everybody. So she doesn't remember that people said anything to her, but she just los polacos como que no. She didn't feel comfortable. And when she had the chance, when she had time on a Sunday, when the weather was good, she would go under the railroad viaduct and she'd go to St. Francis of Assisi, right? La Catedral Mexicana. That's where she enjoyed going to Mass. So, but she enrolled her kids at St. Procopius School. At the end of my interview with Julia, she had limited mobility at that point. She asked me to go into her bedroom and get something, which I'm kind of this is weird, I'm going into this lady's bedroom. Okay, so very neatly made bed, and on top of it was this 8x10 glossy photograph. She had pulled it out that morning. She knew she probably wanted to show it to me, but I had to go through 2.5 hours of interview, which was a fabulous interview. But this photograph, which was taken on December 12th, 1976, the day of the Virgin of Guadalupe, a group of parishioners from St. Procopius took a gift of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe to the mayor as a gift. So And the parish had agreed that it was going to be Ruben and Julia who were going to represent the parish. And they took these kids who were not theirs, by the way. I don't know. So I guess like kids with like better folkloric costumes, right? Anyways, for me, this was actually what I wanted to be on the cover of my book, but you know, I got punked. They gave me this, so, which I also love. But like to me, this was the epitome of Chicago Católico. Considering Julia's impoverished childhood, this photo expresses an adulthood of stability, respectability, faith, and belonging. Julia stood proudly as a Mexican-American Catholic with the pinnacle of her adopted city, the mayor, himself also a Catholic and a devotee of the Virgin Mary. He was a daily mass goer. With her husband Ruben and the parish children, she represented St. Procopius. 2 decades earlier, she hesitated to attend mass there. Los polacos como que no. In 1976, St. Procopius was home. Chicago had usually been willing to give a chance to Mexicans, fellow Catholics who, like the Irish, Czechs, Poles, and Lithuanians, also expressed their devotion to the Virgin Mary. Pilsen became Chicago's first majority Mexican neighborhood precisely in this decade, in the 1970s, and the Mexican Catholic voices grew louder. Just months after Julia's visit to the mayor's office, Pilsen churches held their first Via Crucis, Living Way of the Cross. On that Good Friday, and for like every year since then, the Via Crucis took over 18th Street. Visiting the mayor's office and the Via Crucis differed greatly in tone and message, but both showed the rise of a Chicago Católico. 7 Pilsen parishes banded together, planning, rehearsing, making costumes, growing beards, renting a horse, to make a Good Friday that no one would forget. The Via Crucis proclaimed Pilsen as a Mexican and Catholic space in a neighborhood dominated just 15 years earlier by Poles, Lithuanians, and Czechs. Unprecedented, the 1977 Via Crucis reflected lofty goals of engaging issues of social justice and embodied an identity at once Mexican, Catholic, and Chicano. Julia Rodriguez's portrait with the mayor and Pilsen's Via Crucis both expressed a strong Mexican and a Catholic identity in 1970s Chicago. These 1970s events were unimaginable in 1918 or in the 1920s when Matias Lara and other Mexicans first arrived in the city. In the 1920s, no one would have imagined that Chicago would become the second largest Mexican metropolis in the United States. No one would imagine that Chicago would become home to a new urban mestizo culture with an identity that spans 2 nations. In the 1920s, no one could have imagined the city would be dotted in parishes that serve Spanish-speaking people. And this is a little thing I found from the Archdiocesan parish finder. You can plug in a language. You want to know where the 3 parishes are with Mass in Vietnamese. It will show you the 3 parishes. This is, I think this is maybe from 2015. These are the places that celebrated Mass in Spanish, but this is just in the city. So the Archdiocese also includes a lot of suburbs, and so the parish finder makes you do city versus suburbs, whatever. In 2015, so starting with just 2 churches with Mass in Spanish, in 2015, Misa en Español was celebrated at 130 parishes in the Archdiocese. So that would be about 40% of the Archdiocese. One of the strange things about finishing up my book about making Mexican parishes was that these have been years of the unmaking and the closing of parishes. When I started this project, once upon a time there were 13, right? When I got involved with doing this research, there were 7 open parishes in Pilsen. Today, there are only 3. I have attended final masses at 2 of them, and including the final mass at St. Adelbert's. This is, it was closed in 2019. This was December 12th, probably December 11th, actually, the night before. People set up an altar on the steps of the locked, desanctified church and spent the night with the Virgin of Guadalupe, and it was cold. So you could do this at home. You could go to a church that's open, but people who were from St. Adelbert's were heartbroken that they had lost their church, and they did it again last year, because I was there on the 12th. There was like stuff still on the steps. So anyway, so this is a very challenging time, the closing of the parishes plus COVID, and so Pilsen's down to just 3 parishes. But the big story that I'm telling is the story of making Mexican parishes that help generations of immigrants create new homes and identities, first at St. Francis of Assisi, and in the past half century at parishes across Pilsen. I'm going to end my formal remarks today with the dedication to my book. I dedicated the book to the very generous people del pasado, del presente, of St. Francis of Assisi, St. Adelbert, St. Anne, St. Paul, St. Pius, St. Procopius, and Providence of God, to the generations of Chicagoans to come from Mexico and around the world. And that's all I have to say formally. I welcome your questions. Just a few things. The book is available. You can actually buy it probably like a mile from here. Chicago History Museum stocks it, which is kind of shocking. So, and if anybody online or in this audience wants to send me an email, I will enter you into a drawing and I will send you a copy of my book. So, especially if I have any like poor, impoverished students. So, the rest of you can buy your own. But no, send me an email. So, send me questions, send me stories. So, it's been interesting doing these online things. I get people who come from out of the woodwork and say like, oh my God, you showed this picture of my parents. Like I heard that you have a talk, and is there a book? And so like this is, strangers are connecting, and it's been kind of a cool thing. So that's what I got.
All right, so Deborah has graciously agreed to answer some questions. So if you do have a question, in order to facilitate being heard online as well, please come up to this microphone. Is this on? Is it on? Are we doing okay? And if you're online, then go ahead and put the question in using the question function, and we'll get to your question. We'll relay it to Deborah. There we go. Okay. Does anybody here in the room have a question? Jody?
Hi. Thank you so much for all the texture and detail that you shared with us about your engagement with these parishes. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about being a participant observer. You mentioned that you're at certain ceremonies, and I also do work as a participant observer, and maybe what some of the advantages and dangers, pitfalls are of that approach to research.
So great question. And I always feel like I'm maybe overstepping things by calling myself a participant observer. That's what my friends who are anthropologists call this. as a historian, well, first of all, I never thought I'd be working with like people who are alive. So when I was deciding about going to grad school, I was thinking maybe anthro, maybe history. But if I had done anthro, I would have had to talk to living people. And when I was 25, that just sounded too scary. So it's kind of funny. I've changed over time. When I first started doing this, hanging out, getting invited to families' 4th of July picnics, and going to these reunions from these like lay organizations, I didn't realize I was doing participant observer. But then I started I knew what anthropologists did, and I kind of read a little bit more about ethnography. I'd take a little bit of notes, and if I was good, I actually typed them up and tried to make sense out of them and started incorporating some of those reflections in here. So, I can be talking about the 1940s, but I'll end a chapter talking about what happened on the Sunday in, 2005 when I went to Mass at St. Francis. Mexican people in Chicago feel, I think, so invisible. People who grew up at these churches feel like nobody cares about their history. And they just have always been so welcoming to me. And, when I said I wanted to write a book about St. Francis of Assisi, I was in. Somebody's going to tell a story about our sports teams. That was they were did anybody ever tell you about the gym? And I got invited to all these gym reunions. So, I'm not trained to do it, but I think a lot of it was learning to take notes, kind of thinking about thick description, kind of Clifford Geertz sort of stuff. And I did a workshop at the University of Iowa, a creative nonfiction workshop, and felt kind of emboldened to be a non-traditional historian. There's lots of this book that is told kind of in chronological order, and in 1947 this happened, in 1948, blah, blah, blah. But I also learned you could tell stories, and that sometimes it was really illuminating to tell a story about something that happened 3 years ago. So, I do, in the epilogue of the book, I tell about the experience of going to the church closings and what it's like. I'm probably, at some events, I'm a participant when I help out at the kermesse and I get to wear a hairnet and it's 80 degrees and I'm on my feet all day. I think that makes me a real participant. When I'm at Mass, I'm much more of an observer because I'm not Catholic. So, and everybody always wants to know, you wrote this book and you're not Catholic? I came into the book as a historian of Mexico. I wanted to know what it meant to be Mexican in Chicago. And I picked churches as a place to do it. So it's been great. And it's, what? I find no matter where I travel now, I go to Iowa. Oh, where's Spanish Mass? What time is Spanish Mass in West Liberty, Iowa? It's like a farm town with 4,000 people. Oh, I'm going to stop there at 11 because that's when the Spanish Mass is. I want to see what that, I'm always scoping out all of the Spanish language masses in Detroit, which is much closer to my house. So I'm a little obsessed.
Was Pius V always a Dominican church, and did that change? Was there something different about the fact that it was Dominican that either helped it or hindered it from welcoming Mexican folks? So
Pius, I don't know if it was Dominican from the very start, but it's been Dominican at least since the 1920s. So it was, the first parish that was set up for English-speaking people. If you take that story back to the late 19th century, that was kind of an Irish parish. It was an offshoot from Holy Family, just north of there. But the Dominicans have been running it for at least 100 years. And they like to say in their parish history that they were the first one to offer Mass in Spanish. I've done the research. It's not true. They were not the first ones. So, but to me, it doesn't matter. Was the first one in 1962? Was the first one in 1963? Whatever. There's a few of them that start around the same time. They had some priests who led a kind of a welcoming integration of Mexican people. There were Polish American priests that learned Spanish so that they could do that. At the same time, I've met plenty of Mexican American people who talk about how unwelcoming the parishioners were. So that like parishioners would tell them, you know, the Polish American, you need to go to the basement and you can't participate in this event and we don't want your food at our church fair. So you had the leadership saying, you know, mystical body of Christ, everybody's included, everybody's here to support the parish. And I think there were a good 10 years that were uncomfortable on the level of the people sitting in the pews. And so maybe offering Mass in Spanish was one of the things that made it easier. So, yeah. And another thing about them being Dominicans, by the late 60s, the Dominicans in Chicago are starting to send people on to do mission work in Latin America. Father Chuck Dom, who is retired clergy there, he had worked in Peru for several years. So, you know, they have a good sense of Latin America. Many people like Chuck Dom spoke Spanish very well, and a real sense of like notions of like Christian-based communities. St. Pius ends up in like the 1970s doing a lot of kind of progressive cutting-edge stuff. So 50s and 60s, you know, it's a mixed bag. Yeah.
Deborah, we have a question, comment question from someone online. Amira Orozco says, thanks, this was great, and your book was very life-giving to me to learn about this history. Can you speak a little more to the role of iconography in your study? It seems to speak a little to the distinctly Catholic side of the project and the making of Mexican identity in Chicago. And then she has in parentheses, this has implications about the charismatic renewal, of course, but we don't have to get into that here. And she also says that her question is even more relevant now, having heard you said you're not Catholic. She also mentions that Geertz and Robert Ossi are exactly the people and historian that I thought of when reading this book.
We know it's a good day when people bring up Robert Ossi and say, because he's a historian of Catholicism, kind of a dean of Catholic studies who is now at Northwestern. He wrote a really fabulous study about an Italian parish in East Harlem that I read pretty early as I was thinking about things. That was one of the places where I kind of got the idea of like going and taking a lot of notes and doing thick description, because Bob Ossi did that. I probably read more Bob Ossi than I ever read Clifford Geertz, but okay. So iconography, I pay a lot of attention. You know, I like try as much as possible to think about, you know, like in what decade did the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos actually come into these churches? And one of the things I've found is it can be really hard to like map those, like to get specific years on things like that. I just finished actually writing a paper that's going to be published in Mexico about that Virgin of San Juan devotion in Chicago, and that's one of the things I'm trying to trace, is like, when did it come into St. Procopius? When did it come into St. Francis? So, images change in churches, and I think part of why I'm interested in that, I'm maybe more interested in it than the parishioners were, and I think it's because of being a historian of Mexico and kind of knowing about like what saints and Marian devotions interested people there. I'm very interested like now in watching these kind of like level 2 saints as they come into parishes in Chicago and the United States. Like now there's all these Cristero saints who are coming into churches in Brooklyn and churches on the northwest side of Chicago. I knew the saints from Mexico, and I've had, as a non-Catholic, I had to learn all of this Catholic American iconography, and to realize that things have never been set in stone, that there's always been these kind of like trends in terms of what people are devoted to. I would have thought, like until I read more Catholic history, I would have thought the Sacred Heart had been like something people were into forever. It turns out the French really pushed that in the 19th century, and when you had French clergy and you had French sisters who were pushing the Sacred Heart, they were the ones who brought it into Mexico, and there were a lot of French priests in northern Mexico and Texas, and that's part of how that gets ingrained. So I pay a lot of attention to that, and further thinking about iconography, change over time, going back to Amira's question, my graduate mentor was William B. Taylor, who is kind of like the dean of colonial Mexican Catholic history. He wrote this tome, it's like 700 pages before the footnotes, called Magistrates of the Sacred, which is about parish priests in Mexico. So while I was studying all of that, we were talking endlessly about iconography and how things change. So one of the things that I learned about recently, I'm doing research for a book about the Claretians in the United States. When they opened up the parish in South Chicago, Our Lady of Guadalupe, in the 1920s, every September they were having a fiesta for Nuestra Señora de Jacona. Jacona's a pretty small town in western Michoacan. Like, it's a town with, 15,000 people. I lived in the next town. I never heard about Nuestra Señora de Jacona. Something was going on, and every September they would have like a special mass and festivities. And I was like, were there a bunch of people from Jacona living in South Chicago? Like, I wasn't seeing any. It turns out there was a visiting priest from Mexico. He was, exiled because of the Cristero War, right? The anti-clerical violence. And he kind of landed amongst the Claretians in Chicago. And he was connected with that diocese. And I think he was pushing Our Lady of Jacona. And then it just disappears. Like, by the late 1920s, they're not doing it anymore. So it's endless. There's a lot of needles and a lot of haystacks when we're talking about iconography. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation. When I was a kid, I remember a TV show that I was enamored with called You Are There. And I felt like you reenacted that tonight because you were there, and we are there now because of your presentation. Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, that is, that was in your picture, made me wonder, when did citizenship come into these people's lives if they became citizens? I'm assuming that somewhere along the line they did, because Mayor Daley wouldn't go out to anyone who was a non-voter in this city. He was always after votes from everyone. And I also was wondering, did you come across any parishes that really fostered citizenship amongst the Mexican Catholic communities? Because certainly there was a great movement afoot with some of the bishops in this country, Mundelein included, that were very insistent on that they wanted their ethnic Catholics to become Americans.
Speak English.
Because they didn't. Yes, because they didn't want them consigned to second-class citizenship. Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting set of kind of questions and observations. So Mundelein, by the 1920s, the U.S. passes its restrictive immigration laws, 1921, 1924. That's precisely when the Mexicans are really coming in big numbers. And he had said, we're not setting up any more national parishes. We did that for, the Poles and, the Lithuanians and blah, blah, blah. And we're not doing national parishes anymore because people need to, integrate and, we're all American Catholics. But he realized, he would make an exception for the Mexicans. And the Mexicans, Our Lady of Guadalupe and St. Francis were the last two national parishes. But he didn't make big announcements about it. And, he sort of quietly approved them. The Claretians are going to run them. These Spanish-speaking people, they need their spaces. They need this. So officially he's talking about Americans all, but he lets the Mexicans do this. And where you see a real contrast is when the Puerto Ricans come to Chicago at the end of World War II. No such thing as a Puerto Rican parish, never. So they never get their own spaces. And the notion is very much they need to integrate. Mundelein had a bit of a soft spot for Mexicans. I think they saw they saw the Mexican church as being under fire by the Mexican revolutionary government, and then in the 1920s, again, by this very anti-clerical state. Some people go for citizenship early. I've found examples of Mexicans who are doing like WPA jobs, which is like the little girl with the ice cream cone. Her dad, he had a WPA job, and they lived by St. Francis. So those parents actually, they were Mexican, they were young adult immigrants, they spoke to their kids in English. So you see a variety of practices. In general, Mexicans did not rush to get citizenship in this country. It was easy enough to work, and the 1930s is a period of a lot of deportations, not particularly in Chicago. So Los Angeles, Detroit are decimated by the so-called repatriation 1930s. Chicago, it doesn't really happen. So there's a new book which is out, which probably deals more with the citizenship question. There's a book called Making Mexican Chicago by Mike Amezcua of Georgetown. It just came out like a month ago. And, he's very interested in things like the Daily Machine and voting and aldermen. So there's probably more there. And, that just wasn't my thing, so I didn't ask a lot of. Most of the people I interviewed were Mexican American, so that's like, that's not even a question, right? So I interviewed some immigrants, but maybe not as many as I thought I might have. The Mexican Americans had a lot of stories to tell, so I kind of stuck with them.
We have just a comment from Monica Andrade saying, Mazel tov on your lovely book and research, que Dios te bendiga.
Thank you, Monica.
So if you come from Poland in 1890 to Chicago, you're pretty much, that's a long and arduous journey, and you know that you're not going back. If you come from Mexico in 1990, you're probably going back and forth. You got more communication. You got more compatriots and so on. Does that make a difference as far as holding on to the language and the culture, do you think?
So I think, because of sharing the land border and the relative ease of crossing, maybe until the 1990s, there was plenty of circular migration. People who come up to Chicago for a couple years, go back, mom is sick, you go back for a year, or people who would work in Chicago for 8 months and go back to Michoacan for 3 months and then come back up. So there's a very long story with Mexican migration with the circular. Mm-hmm. But national immigration and border policies really change a lot in the last 20 years. Nobody circles anymore. People who have citizenship, if they can, they will pull their kids out of school as early as possible in December. So, because you want to get back to your village before December 12th. Ideally you're there for the whole novena. So, and you're staying ideally through the 6th of January. There are places in Mexico that have moved the dates of their village fiesta. They've changed their patron saint. There's this town, San Ignacio, Jalisco. It's a pretty small place, like under 10,000 people. San Ignacio people all moved to Detroit. Half of the Mexicans in the city of Detroit are from San Ignacio, or 2 generations ago. It's amazing, what a straight line that is. So when is the saint's day of St. Ignatius? It's July 31st. They moved the fiesta because people need to be in Detroit working. They're working the lawn services, right? And they're working at the orchards and this and that. They move the fiesta, and they have the fiesta of the patron saint in January, because if you're working in Michigan outdoor, you can come back and you can be in January there. So they literally have changed this important part of like the liturgical calendar, to accommodate immigration. It's a mixed bag. People who are citizens, and it's an increasing number of people who are, they go back. And there's a lot of people who are raising money in hometown associations to do things like, expand the chapel back in the hometown. They do all these civic projects. It might be build an old people's home, build a new stadium for jaripo, like equestrian, Michoacan kind of rodeo stuff. Some of the things they do are about improving the church, expanding the church in their home communities, and some things are different. They'll bring priests up from their hometowns to hold special events up here. There's ways in which there is definitely back and forth. But I think, for a lot of people who are younger and entered this country without papers, they're stuck here. They can't go back. Because if they go back, they can't come back here.
All right.
So, yeah.
Do we have other questions?
Not a question, but Anita Granado Rosso says, thank you for this enlightening presentation. I come from the historical background of Mexican Catholicism. She was born and raised in South Chicago as a product of the Claretian Parish and School of Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Thank you, Anita. And Anita, being from South Chicago, this is a good reminder. There's a new WTTW documentary, which will show on April 29th, which is called Our Soldiers, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish, the oldest Mexican parish in Chicago, lost more men in Vietnam than any parish in the United States. And they have this new documentary that I got to see like a preview of. It's like interviews with the surviving family members, interviews with vets who knew these, I think it was 17 young men who were killed in the war. And, everybody grew up at Our Lady of Guadalupe. They were their neighbors, they were their relatives, they were their co-parishioners. They interview like an older Claretian who was assigned to the parish like in 1970. It's a really impactful movie. So this will be on Chicago Stories. And it streams for free as well as showing live on WTTW.
Well, wonderful. As long as we're doing plugs, let me do a plug for our next two events. This series on Catholic immigrants in the United States continues. We have an event on Filipino Catholics with Dr. April Faye Manalang, including, and that'll be all in person on May 1st, and that includes a Filipino food. So please mark that on your calendar. And Matthew Kressler talking about African American Catholics in the Great Migration from the South. So please pay attention to that. Let me thank, before we thank Deborah again, let me thank Karen Kraft and Marlon Aguilar and Finnegan Chu for all of the technical wizardry that goes into a hybrid event. And finally, last but very much not least, let's all thank Deborah Kanter for this tremendous introduction to her work.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.